I'm stuck in a time loop, over and over again. I live the same 4 months until the world ends, and I die. Then I wake up and I live it again. Every time I wake up on November 3rd, 2020, the next 2.5 months are plagued with the escalation of already high partisan tensions, resulting from a heavily contested election. The biased media heavily fuels the tensions. I've lived the same 4 months for over 3 years now, and I still can't tell you who won. The nation erupts on January 20th as 2 people claim the presidency of the most powerful country in the world. Both sides have half the nation backing them up. Even the military splits. January 20th is the day the war starts. By early February, the civil war becomes a world war as every major nation takes sides. For the next month, the deadliest battles in human history erupt all over the globe. The brunt of it all happens right here in my homeland. The first time I died was at the end of February. I'll admit that I chose my side and joined in the war. I was shot in the head. The second time, I thought I could ride the war out, but my apartment building caught fire. I had the choice to burn to death or jump 23 stories to my death. I jumped. The third time I moved elsewhere, still intending to ride out the war. I can't tell you who fires the first nuclear missile, but one hit my city before anyone can flee. I died in the blast. The fourth time, I fled the city beforehand just to die a far worse death from radioactive fallout. I've tried everything. I've moved to different locations and tried different strategies just to die another horrible death. I've been blasted to pieces, hit with an RPG, burned to death, cooked to death by cancerous radiation, murdered by looters, and even was once ravaged by a bear while trying to survive in the wilderness. I've killed myself too, just to wake back up on November 3rd. I'm convinced that my only way out of this time loop is to somehow survive. The furthest I've made it is March 3rd, 2021. I'm not sure if any humans survive much longer than that. I'm making plans for my next survival attempt. This is my warning. I hope you do better at surviving than I do. As an animatronic engineer, please look closely at all of the lifelike figures at Disney. It was really degrading growing up having a younger sister who excelled in sports, and I was cursed with having a complete lack of coordination, as my sister made all of the local newspaper headlines for her athletic prowess and went on Friday night dates with the high school quarterback. I would sit alone in my bedroom trying to make lifelike animatronics from whatever spare parts I could find around the neighborhood. It was hard not to be viewed by my father as a disappointment, especially when Dad would get all excited when baseball season would be starting, and he thought this would be the year that I would hopefully make the school's baseball team. But the only thing that would happen is I would accidentally get a black eye from not being able to catch his baseball throws and eventually be cut from the school's team. I was just different. I lacked social skills to the point where every teacher and guidance counselor suggested that I get tested for autism or Asperger's syndrome. However, my parents had an old school mentality and wanted me to adapt to the world on my own. So I never got any services or help. The one thing that I appreciated about my parents growing up is when they took our family to Disney World twice a year. As a young boy, I was enthralled with animatronics that multiple rides had to offer. My mom always said that watching me on rides such as the Pirates of the Caribbean or It's a Small World were the only times in my life that she saw me happy. In high school, I might have been a social outcast, but I did excel in math and was taking advanced calculus, which got the attention of Penn State, which is nationally known for their engineering programs and in particular animatronics. So when I received my acceptance letter during my senior year of high school, my mother came rushing in my room. When she heard me yelling with excitement, which she had to that point only ever heard my sister do 1,000 times before when celebrating a field hockey or softball win. But she never heard me express such emotions. So I went off to Happy Valley in central Pennsylvania and placated to my strong points of not socializing and doing nothing more than studying. As others would love to drink and smoke, I would love to hang out in the engineering lab and tinker with animatronics all night, so much so that I came really close to graduating with a 4.0 GPA. I got a 3.99, which was unheard of for an American student at Penn State in my animatronics engineering program. My hard work had finally paid off as Disney offered me a position on their Imagineering animatronics department, where I would specifically be working on the It's a Small World attraction ride under the chief engineer, Bob Stone. Bob said he was really impressed with my humbleness considering my near 4.0 GPA, which I think he confused with my complete social awkwardness. Bob was a really nice guy who was short and obese and kind of looked like Mario from the Super Mario Nintendo game. But Bob had grey hair and I think his ancestors were from Germany. The following July after graduating, my extended family had a 4th of July get-together where my father introduced me to everyone I've met a million times over the years as my son. He was just so proud of me that someone at the party was talking about Napoleon and my father interjected and said, "Did you know my son got a job at the prestigious Imagineering animatronics department at Disney World?" Where each person at the party must have heard 5 times that night. I guess to my dad, my new job was equally as good as making it into the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame. Bob looked to be in his 60s and was highly regarded as bringing It's a Small World into the 21st century while still maintaining its original ambience. Bob is considered a legend for doing so because Disney had a way of replacing old stale rides with the newest best things. Anyone who had been to the Magic Kingdom in the early 1980s can attest to this, or even more so to Disney's Hollywood Studios, where nearly the whole park has recently been revamped. Bob showed me the ins and outs of all the lifelike child animatronics and the countries that they represented. Every movement had to be synchronized precisely, and Bob's intensity level would go up each morning right before the ride would open to the public. I viewed Bob really as being married to his job, and he would jokingly refer to the child animatronics as his own children. Bob was so invested in his work that he would even personally take plane rides to the different representative countries to really get a feel for their cultures. As for the months went on, Bob started to build a respect for my dedication, so much so that he wanted me to join him for a weekend trip to Romania to get a feel for the children and their culture, where Bob would actually stay the remainder of the week in Romania and I would go back home to Disney World on Sunday night. This was considered a big compliment from Bob because it meant that he needed me at the park in case any issues arose, where I could possibly step in and address the issue. We took a red-eye flight to Romania, and when we arrived, I was really impressed with their local customs. Being that Bob was from Disney, he had built up a rapport with some of the local officials, where they even put on a celebratory dance on for us, similar to the one that occurs on the It's a Small World ride. The kids even wore almost the identical outfits to the ones at Disney World. I knew the Romanian officials really just wanted our Disney money, especially when I got the sad opportunity to tour a local impoverished orphanage where the small children weren't afforded the basic necessities in life. It was so sad that I couldn't wait to leave on Sunday night and go back to Florida. I really had a special appreciation for Bob being able to make all of these trips over the years and even staying for the remainder of this week. I arrived back at Disney early Monday morning. Unfortunately, I noticed one of the Russian animatronics children was starting to break down. I relayed the information to Bob when I called him the following day, where he was disappointed but joked that it figures because coincidentally, I have an upcoming trip to Russia. Bob got back from Romania and everything was status quo at Disney. Bob said that he feels rejuvenated with being engulfed in the country's culture as he worked throughout the night to update some of the Romanian child animatronics. I might be on the autism spectrum, but Bob was 10 times more so with his unwavering focus. Where I would work 10 hours, Bob would work 20 hours a day, and he was more than twice my age. Even though the Russian animatronic needed more acute attention, I learned not to question the genius in Bob's methods. Bob asked me to get the entire attraction ready for the next morning, and when morning came, I was so impressed with the updates that Bob had made to the Romanian animatronics. The only exception was when I stood below one of the Romanian animatronics and I noticed it was leaking a burgundy type fluid, which I only noticed because it got on my white shirt. I frantically called Bob because I couldn't fix the leak, and on his 2 hours of sleep, he rushed down and fixed the fluids that were leaking from the gear suspensions. As Bob explained it, Bob was considered an ultimate master at his craft, and I still needed more time for Bob to teach me everything about the machines. Bob eventually went to Russia, and I didn't want to experience the same sadness again as I did in Romania, so I stayed home this time. When Bob was gone, I had accidentally broke one of the specialty tools for the animatronics, and I had to go to the Pirates of the Caribbean ride for a replacement. While I was there, one of the long-term engineers was amazed that I didn't quit or disappear. He told me that none of Bob's assistants have worked out over the years, and he saw the last young guy yelling and screaming before he literally ran off. I was kind of taken aback by all of this because maybe it's my personality, but Bob hasn't been mean or disrespectful towards me at all since I started working under him. When Bob came back to Disney from Russia, he had the same vigor as when he returned from Romania. He worked feverishly when the ride was closed at night to update the Russian animatronics. So much so that with all of his hard work, unfortunately, his obesity-related diabetes that his body couldn't handle actually caused him to have a minor stroke, and he had to be hospitalized. This was shocking because he hadn't called out sick in over 40 years. This now put a lot of stress on me because I was temporarily doing Bob's chief engineering position for the ride, and I don't know everything that there is to know yet. As I was doing all the tests for the ride the next morning, something was off with one of the Russian animatronics. When the one machine wouldn't stay upright, I started to panic because I only had 2 hours before the ride would open to the public. I was turning and twisting the thing so much that I was afraid that I was only making the animatronic worse. I really felt like a fish out of water compared to Bob and his expertise. I got so desperate that I reluctantly called Bob at the hospital. Bob said in a weak voice that he was actually glad that I called, and he instructed me to use special hydraulic fluid in one of his toolboxes that was in small needle-filled syringes, and for me to inject them into the faulty Russian machine. So I gathered the syringes and went back to the machine. I was probably about 15 feet from that female Russian faulty animatronic, where my mind and my feet were both telling me something wasn't right, and I started to walk very slowly because what my eyes were looking at reminded me of when my then toddler cousin was put on a horse pony by herself and she started to weep uncontrollably. Now, unbelievably, this machine is doing the same thing. I just stood there with this needle syringe in my hand, trying to block out the deepest, most unfathomable reason why this machine was shedding tears. My mind was slowly drifting back to when Bob and I went to Romania and how Bob paid close attention to this one young black-haired boy who had piercing brown eyes. My mind was trying to block out that same resemblance of the Romanian boy at the orphanage and the machine that was leaking gear fluid, and how my naive self at that time said, "No, it can't be," and just returned to work. So I looked at this poor Russian animatronic girl and I remembered how proud my dad was of me during the 4th of July party, where prior to that, I had been nothing more than a complete disappointment to him my whole life, and how Bob would fire me if I didn't inject this poor Russian girl. So with the needle syringe in my hand, I looked one more time at the weeping girl, and I was just overtaken with emotions, and I started crying for what the unspeakable horrors this child has faced. Then I called Disney's park manager and told her that It's a Small World won't be operational today. My eyes surveyed all the It's a Small World children, and I said, "Heavens no," as I glared out at the hundreds of little children's eyes, crucified on metal frames for nothing more than the amusement of mostly unbeknownst middle-class Americans. Not really knowing what to do, so I called a local monastery up and explained to a nun that I don't know what that monster Bob did to those kids, but rather than have them viewed as freak shows on the news, if the nuns instead could handle this situation for me, where it turned out the nuns actually knew one of Disney's board members who helped arrange for transportation to house the kids in one of their larger monasteries, which would be quietly funded by Disney to avoid bad press. That night, I had the dubious job of releasing all of the bolts and mechanisms that were holding the children in place. Bob had whiskey in one of his toolboxes, so considering I never drank a drop of alcohol my whole life, I was plastered by the time. I had all the kids released and laid out on the floor. I must have said sorry several thousand times to the kids as I was releasing them. I learned that Bob had actually went to medical school in Mexico prior to becoming an engineer, where he learned how to be a surgeon. So those kids were basically half machines by the time Bob was done with them, and he would inject them with embalming fluid and adrenaline to help keep their smiling faces. I put the actual old vintage animatronic machines that were in storage back in place of the real kids. Then I paid Bob a visit at the hospital. Because of Bob's obesity, he was a diabetic and had spare insulin in his toolboxes, which I brought with me to the hospital. Thankfully for me, Bob had his own room in the hospital at the end of the hallway, away from the nurse's station. When I got into Bob's room, he was sedated as the nurse earlier had said from the diagnostic procedure he had earlier in the day, so he didn't even notice when I came into the room. I took away his nurse called bell light and I said, "Bob, I know you hired me because you thought I was socially awkward and you thought I would just be your lackey and would do whatever you told me to do." Bob kind of looked at me with his eyes half open and looking like he was going to fall asleep. Then I said, "Bob, I released all the kids. Can you believe that?" He then perked up a little and looked angry. I then took the needle-filled syringes of Bob's fast-acting insulin and injected him with 2 vials worth that would put down 10 horses. He was too sedated to put up a fight, and he slowly drifted out of consciousness. I waited 10 minutes until he was completely blue. Then I went to the nurse's station and said, "There's something wrong with Bob. He doesn't look good." After Bob was pronounced dead, I called Universal Studios to see if they were hiring, because the thought of that weeping girl and the rest of those kids will never get out of my mind. I am a night worker, have been one for over 10 years now, And this is the story of how I rebelled against my own boss, how I went up against the one who held my hand as I walked into this business, helped me learn the ropes, guided me, protected me when I started working with the strangest freaks. It certainly wasn't the easiest decision to make, because compounding the anxiety and guilt of betraying my benefactor, clawing at my chest, was the fear twisting my stomach in knots. Fear of turning on the most powerful woman in the city. I had known about the madame being the head of the largest crime ring here for quite a while by then. By this new revelation that she was also involved in something supernaturally sinister added a whole new depth to her already intimidating presence. It made me feel like a foolish child flailing around on the loose, wet soil on the bank of a murky lake, believing it to be far more shallow than it really was. But as terrifying as the prospect of her retribution was, the betrayal was a necessity, like a bitter pill that just had to be swallowed. I could either stab her in the back or end up as one of the subjects of whatever god-awful experiment she was running in the establishment, by having those nightmare-inducing worms devour me from the inside out while she observed the whole sordid process through the camera mounted in my private room from the safety of her office. It took Lil P and I weeks to prepare to make a move against her. Most of it can be chalked up to Lil P's justified but exhausting caution that bordered on the overzealous. He didn't fully trust the stalker, and so whatever plans we made with that person took twice as long to formulate as they otherwise would have. He took his sweet time approaching some of the madame's grunts or soldiers that he believed he could trust, deciding how to get them on our side. How much to reveal to each of them seemed to be another insurmountable obstacle. In the end, we agreed to tell most of them that there were moles in the organization who were plotting to kill the madame, and that the highest levels of secrecy were needed to weed them out. Some of them had experienced strange shit themselves, odd sounds emanating from empty spaces, long worms that oozed white pus and sizzled and slipped into thin cracks on the ground, people suddenly behaving in erratic, often violent manner. They knew something was wrong and trusted Lil P to uncover it all. We peppered their brains with bits and pieces of the truth. I know I sound impatient, dangerously so, but you can't really blame me. Victoria was missing. Elise was on the verge of being transformed into some worm-like monstrosity, and I was still working, even after finding hard evidence of some ghastly worm demon walking around the establishment when I broke into it. Pretending that everything was alright was no mean feat. It took everything I had to control my trembling hands and smile through the gritted teeth whenever I came across the madame. A headache-removing wave of relief flooded through my body when we finally decided to act. Lil P had been insistent on setting up a base far from the long reach of the madame's all-consuming shadow, a launchpad for our efforts, a safe place we could retreat to if shit got too crazy. It was the stalker who suggested the place, and the sharp twinkle that appeared in Lil P's eyes at its mention let me know we had found our target. The disappearing house, the one with the masturbating serial killer, made perfect sense to get to the root of it all by going back to the place where it all began, right? What better place to hide from the madame than a house that seems to move through space at the command of its owner or occupant? It seemed like the perfect idea. We had numbers on our side, not to mention an immortal monster, and we weren't directly attacking the madame either. Should have been the safest course of action. If only we knew just how much shit would spiral out of control. The disappearing house. The stalker took full responsibility of finding the house. He scoured all the brothels in the city, tracked the movements of the girls who did home visits to try and pin down the jack-off murderer. Slowly, patterns started to emerge, timings of the calls, the kind of girls he'd asked for and who would eventually disappear, what brothels he'd get in contact with, locations where the house would pop up at. When the stalker found it, the house was an apartment. The building was small, so small it seemed stunted, malnourished even, as if the construction crew ran out of concrete and just decided to slap together whatever shit they could. It had 4 stories, each smaller than what should be legally permissible. Low ceilings, tiny barred windows, narrow doors that suggested narrower hallways, crumbling tilted walls slattered with moss, an uncomfortably small yard choked with uncomfortably tall weeds. We were parked about 100 meters away from the building, yet just looking at it, even from all that distance, made me feel nauseous. "This is it, our little bunker," the stalker said, blowing out thick clouds of smoke as he leaned against his battered white van. Shotgun resting on the rusted roof. "Are you people ready? They need to be able to move at a moment's notice." "Don't worry about them," Lil Pimp retorted. "They'll be ready for anything." The stalker raised his eyebrow. "You threatening me now?" Lil P chuckled derisively. "You can bet your ass on that, motherfucker. You try anything, and I do mean anything, my boys and I will pump you full of so many holes, even your unholy ass won't be able to stitch itself back together." The stalker snarled. "Pfft, sounds fun." "Alright," I snapped. "Put your dicks back in your pants. This is really not the time for a pissing contest. We are on the same side here." "We are," I repeated myself, giving Lil P a sharp look. "Because if we weren't, the madame would gobble us up, bone and all. So if neither of you wants to die, I suggest putting your egos aside, at least for the time being." They both grunted in response. A short and awkward pause followed, one that was broken by the shrill ringing of a cell phone. The stalker swiped his thumb on the oily screen of his phone and answered. "Hello." "Yes, she is here." "Uh-huh. I'm sending her in." He ended the call and smiled at me. "The horny bastard's waiting for you." I nodded, took a deep breath, and adjusted my blonde wig. "Okay, let's fucking do this." "Alright," Lil Pimp said, checking his pistol for ammo. "Let's go. And don't worry, I'm right behind you." "I'm not worried." I lied. "Awesome," the stalker said, sliding his shotgun off the roof of his van. "Proceed then. I'll come up from the street on the eastern side and blow that asshole's head off if he tries to pull something." He didn't wait for a reply and slipped off into an unlit alley crammed between 2 buildings to our left. I waited for the sound of his footsteps to get fainter before walking towards the building. The area we were in was a low-income neighborhood. Too many people jammed into too many houses, all built too close to each other. It should have been loud, even at that odd hour, but the fact that it was deathly silent was more than a little unnerving. Maybe the residents here had seen Lil P's heavily armed friends moving through the streets and had sensed that a storm was coming, one that was best avoided as much as possible. A dog's guttural barks pierced the silence as I strode towards the building. I could hear Lil Pimp behind me, gliding from car to utility pole to overflowing garbage bin, never once stepping out of the shadows. To my far left and right, Lil P's men moved towards the house. I spotted the stalker with them as well. The short metal gate of the apartment building swung open with a prolonged groan. Deja vu. The serial killer was waiting for me. I bit my lip, hoping my wig would be enough to fool him. If he recognized me as the girl who attacked him with pepper spray and ran away, he was likely to rush back into the building and teleport himself off to somewhere far beyond our reach. That would be terrible. The stalker had said we should use a different girl for the initial contact. I was against it. There was no way I was dragging someone else into this shit. Maybe it was the wrong decision. I was certainly rethinking my stance as I got closer to the house. Samantha, right? My mouth dried up. I recognized the voice. It was flatter, more emotionless than when I'd last met him, but it was undoubtedly him. Yeah, I replied, deliberately making my voice a little hoarse, but not ridiculously so. That's me. Well, come on in. I frowned at the robot-like monotony of his voice, but didn't have the time to contemplate on its implications, because right that very second, he took a step forward. A frightened scream escaped my mouth before I could stop myself. His eyes had been gouged out, and in those wet, pulpy holes, white worms writhed like maggots. His jaw had been ripped clean off. His fat black tongue flapped around on his neck. "Well, what are you waiting for?" he asked. I don't know, but he did. He didn't have the necessary tools to vocalize his thoughts. Yet, that didn't seem to stop that bastard. Lil P walked out from behind a car, aiming his gun at this monster. But before he could pull the trigger, the door to the building was thrown open, and dozens of these undead worm-infested zombies tumbled out like clutter from a neglected closet. They trampled on one another as they tried to rush towards me. A sharp crack. A hole opened up in the serial killer's forehead. His head snapped back, then effortlessly moved back into position. Holy fuck, Lil Pimp swore. The serial killer lunged at me, caught me by my wrist, and began dragging me towards the house, even as I screeched my lungs off. Sounds of chaotic gunfire filled the neighborhood as the jack-off murderer's undead comrades funneled past me and charged Lil P. The stalker and the other man joined the fray, emptying their guns into these things that just refused to stay down. I dug my fingernails into the arms of my captor, tore off the very rotting flesh from his bones, but he refused to let me go. I was stunned at his incredible strength. My knees bumped against the 3 stairs that led to the building as he tossed me inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a resounding boom, and the sound of gunfire was immediately muffled, as if it was coming from the other side of town. I winced as I rubbed my arms. Shit. Had he somehow sent me off to somewhere else? What in the fuck was happening? I heard something thumping against the door from the other side, like a body was thrown against it. More gunshots. Fuck. Good. We were still there. The inside of the building was just unnaturally quiet. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around, sucking in quick, shallow breaths. The hallway was long, narrow, lit up fairly yellow from the glow emanating from the candelabras mounted on both the walls. At the end of the hallway was something that turned my blood into ice. This thing was vaguely humanoid, about 8 feet tall, pale skin that was flaking off brown bones, wispy white hair capping an unnatural large skull, long, thin limbs, a large, bulging stomach. It was standing hunched, facing me, with its arms raised and brushing against the low ceiling. The scuffled floorboards creaked as it took long and threatening steps towards me. I backed up instinctively, pressing up against the door. Gunfire continued, unabated outside. The violence there seemed so much better than whatever it was that I was facing. The thing walking towards me growled, a harsh, raspy thing. I whimpered. One more step. Fuck, was this really how I was going to die? Another. No, there must be something I can still do. Think. Another. The distance between us was reduced by half. Fuck, but this thing's strides were long. Another step. The sound of bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor distracted this monstrosity. What now? What else was coming? Bright flames flared somewhere behind the monster. It turned, and I caught a glimpse at who had joined us. It was Victoria, holding up a stick with a flaming rag tied on one end. She waved that stick around in that thing's face, forcing it to the side. Her face was covered in sweat, her wet hair clinging to her face and neck. She jabbed the stick at the thing again and moved between us. "Natasha," she said, her voice tense. "Start walking towards me." My mouth dropped open. What the fuck was she doing here? "Now, please!" Not thinking it wise to question her right then, I obliged, my knees shaking. I took a couple of tentative steps towards her, my eyes fixed on the hulking monstrosity, snarling and snapping its broken teeth at the wavering flame. "The first door to your left," Victoria said. "Open it and walk in." My hand quickly grasped the dusty knob of the door and twisted it. I pushed the door open and pretty much jumped in. "Fuck it," Victoria said, and tossed the stick at the thing and ran towards me. The tall beast let out an anguish-filled screech, and it sounded like a hawk dragging its claws on a chalkboard. She slammed the door shut behind her, placed her head against it, and took a couple of breaths to calm herself down. "Holy shit, Victoria, what the fuck is happening here?" We were inside a small apartment. It had been completely sealed off. Windows were barred and boarded up and painted black. Not even a silver of light filtered in from the outside. Thank God for the hundreds of candles that stood and burned on each flat surface here. A major fire hazard, sure, but at least I wasn't totally in the dark, in the literal sense, that is. "Natasha," Victoria said, her eyes wide. "Thank God you're here." "What are you talking about? You have to help me. It's her, the madame. She's working with my stalker. You have to help me stop them. They're going to destroy this city."